And then as soon as you see my screen share, you can press broadcast and start whenever you want.
Christina, it just said, it didn't say record to cloud. I just clicked record and it says recording. So
yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay. All right. Should I broadcast then?
Yep.
Okay. Christina, I'm clicking broadcast. It's not working.
All right, hold on. Click participants.
Participants.
And can you see if you can remake me the host? Does it say more next to my name?
Yes.
Can you remake me the host?
Yeah, I'll press make host.
All right, you're good.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for session 2 of the Hartford Business Journal and New Haven Biz Economic Outlook webinar series. My name is Greg Bordonaro, and I'm the editor of the Hartford Business Journal, and I'll be your co-host for this virtual event, which is entitled Economic Outlook, What's Next for Connecticut. The coronavirus pandemic has impacted every facet of our lives, causing untold social, economic, and personal disruption and harm. Over the last 2 months, however, Connecticut has seen a steady decline in COVID-19 related hospitalizations, leading Governor Ned Lamont to slowly reopen Connecticut's economy. We are currently in phase 2 of the state's reopening, which is allowing various indoor activities. Governor Lamont has said 95% of the state's economy is now open for business. However, he has delayed the state's phase 3 reopening that was scheduled for mid-July due to concerns about the virus spiking in other states. Despite Connecticut's progress in controlling the virus, COVID-19 has caused significant economic damage to the state. In fact, Connecticut's economy contracted by 4.6% in the first quarter of this year, and the state shed a staggering 269,000 jobs in April. The state's economy began to rebound in May, with companies adding back nearly 26,000 jobs. Regardless, employers face plenty of uncertainty about what is coming next and how they should deploy their capital and workforces in the weeks, months, and even year ahead. Today, we're trying to shed some light on where the greater Hartford, Connecticut, and U.S. economies are headed, and we've assembled a group of experts who will share their insights. Before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to thank our sponsors who helped make this virtual event possible. Thank you to Platinum sponsor UConn School of Business. The UConn School of Business is an internationally recognized leader in preparing the next generation of business professionals. Just in downtown Hartford alone, they educate more than 1,200 students every year across 7 graduate programs, in addition to offering 4 undergraduate majors at the new campus in the Hartford Times building. With nearly 6,200 alumni living or working in the Hartford area, the UConn School of Business has a widespread impact on our community. And thank you to our silver sponsor, Cox Business. Cox Business is the business-to-business division of Cox Communications, and they provide video, voice, data, managed services, and premise-based security services to businesses of all sizes. Cox Enterprises has been a family-owned business for over 120 years and is comprised of 3 divisions: Cox Communications, Cox Media Group, Cox Automotive Group, which includes familiar brands such as Auto Trader and Kelley Blue Book. We have 3 speakers who will be presenting in our webinar today. They include John Traynor, the Executive Vice President and Chief Information Officer at People's United Advisors, David Lehman, the Commissioner of the Department of Economic and Community Development, and David Griggs, President and CEO of the MetroHartford Alliance. Our event this afternoon will run for about an hour, and if you're listening, we encourage you to submit questions to our panelists. You can do that by clicking on the Q&A function on your Zoom screen and typing your questions. We'll get to some of those questions during our open Q&A session at the end of the program. Right now, we're going to kick things off with an economic outlook presentation by John Traynor. John, thanks for joining us. The floor is yours.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, and welcome to everyone that's on the call this morning. You know, the most dangerous words in my profession have always been, this time is different. Well, I think everyone on the call will understand that what we're facing right now, we have never faced before. So I hopefully will communicate that with you with some of the slides I'm going to go through. So if you go to the first slide in the presentation, You've got a nice view of any of you that are skiers. That's the Stowe ski resort in the background there. And really, the analogy that we're using with clients is that we were standing at a peak. The economy in February was doing very well, record low, 50-year low on unemployment. There's a valley. We think we're coming out of the valley, but there are three things, and three things that I'm going to focus on in this presentation, and we'll probably get to with the Q&A. Three things that we think will help us get back up to that peak. Number one, we need a vaccine. That is coming across loud and clear. Yes, we're doing a good job, especially here in Connecticut, controlling new infections. But really what we need to see to get back to where we were is we need a vaccine, hopefully sooner rather than later. Number two, it's the consumer. The unemployment, the extra $600 a week runs out this month. I'm going to show you some data on employment and compensation. A lot of the good news that we've seen on consumer spending is because of that extra $600 a week. So consumer confidence is really going to be tied together with what's going on with their pocketbooks. That's very, very important. And then finally, the election. As we get closer to the fall election season, you're going to see a lot of concern. You're going to see a lot of hemming and hawing. You're going to see, the Trump portfolio versus the Biden portfolio. That's going to cause a lot of confusion. And when people are confused, when they're worried, they tend to sit on their hands. So we need to get through the election. So hopefully we get a vaccine. We're going to keep an eye on the consumer and the election. Those are the big three things that we believe, if they're resolved successfully, will get us back to that peak. So if you go to the next page, one of the things that we're taking a look at, and I'm a rower, so I get to choose the sport that we use here, but we really believe that what we're seeing on a global basis, all of our global leaders, if there was a time to be globally coordinated, today is the time. Now is the time. And unfortunately, we're not. We can have a whole conversation just about what's going on the global basis. But again, what's causing concern and what could be potentially slowing the economic rebound, not only this year, but into next year. A lot of the trade conflicts that we're having, a lot of the finger pointing about the virus. We need to see more global communication, more global coordination. We're not seeing that. And that concerns us as investors and as citizens here in the economy. If you go to the next page, you'll take a look at one of the economic charts that if you've been in any of our presentations, you've seen this. This is the leading economic index. Take a look at this chart. Normally, the LEI rolls over about 12, maybe 18 months before a recession. This has been a very good indicator. It completely failed this time. There was no warning, no indication. And in fact, in January, this indicator started to tick up. A lot of people are getting very positive about the U.S. economy because this ticked up. This speaks to the uniqueness of what we've got. A lot of people talk about the black swan, that unforecastable event. Well, a pandemic, we've had those in the past. We've had very serious infections. The black swan here, that unknown event, was really the shutdown. That was incredible. It was really unpredictable, and that's what really caused the economy to roll over, caused the market to roll over. If you take a look at the next slide, this is really one that I want to spend some time explaining. This is our average hourly earnings. And again, I've used this chart. Normally when we get close to 4%, that's when the Fed gets nervous. That's when they start slowing the economy. Take a look at that line. We saw, with the layoffs, we saw a tremendous spike in compensation. And you would normally look at this and say, whoa, that's fantastic. There is some good news out there. That spike is actually bad news. What that means is that the people that really have suffered the most during this whole economic crisis have been those in the low wage areas. So the reason for that spike is that a lot of the layoffs have taken place in restaurants, they've taken place in hotels, they've taken place in a lot of the low wage areas of our economy. You really can't see it. If you look very closely on this chart, you can see that with the latest employment report, that number actually came down. that's a good sign. We would love to see that come down, actually get way down, because what that tells us is that we're rehiring the low wage workers. We're reopening restaurants, hotels are starting to fill up. We're starting to see some of those seasonal workers come back. We want to see this go. Now, one of the things that I mentioned earlier, the consumer. Now, a lot of those laid off workers, I believe the statistic is 68% of the people that are on unemployment right now are actually making more money than they were making in their prior job. That's because of that extra $600 a week. That's one of the things that's helped consumer spending. So if we don't see a transition, and I know Governor Lamont has actually had some pretty good ideas about how we handle that transition, but if we don't see a transition from the 600, if we just go to zero, you could see consumer spending roll over, you could see consumer confidence roll over, and we could really stumble in this, the early phase of this. So wage increases are very important. Consumer confidence is very important. This is a critical feature to what we're hoping will be a positive support to the economy going forward. If you go to the next page, what you'll see is something that we've talked about in a lot of prior conversations. Again, it's that yield curve. The 10-year bond minus the 2-year bond, normally a great indicator. Now, again, we didn't get into that red zone for a long period. We were inverted for a few days last August, but you'll see the yield curve is actually increasing. The Fed has basically said very clearly they're going to keep rates low. We would love to see that yield curve move up. That would be a real positive indicator for the market, a real positive indicator for the economy. We don't believe we're going to see that, but at least it's in positive territory, which should be a pretty good indicator for the stock market going forward. If you take a look at the next page, what you'll see are just our view of just how severe. Take a look at that 2020 line. Take a look at how severe the decline was. Those of us that were around in 1987, remember what a shock 1987 was. Well, 2020 has actually topped the 1987 severity. So it was an incredible bear market. We actually think we're moving on to a new bull market. Technically, that's if you get out your textbook. If you're investing, though, what we're actually doing is we're telling our clients that this is actually the continuation of a late cycle market. That's what we're seeing. So we're not looking for the table pounding stock market that you saw coming out of the 2009 recession or coming out of the 1982 recession, some big rebounds. We actually think we're going to see more of a late cycle type recovery. If you go to the next page, what you'll see is a chart, a great chart, just talking about the ebb and flow of psychology. And this is why I talked about consumer confidence being so important. Those yellow areas, that's when the trade tensions started to decline. The economic numbers came out. Look at how well the stock market did. As soon as we see some trade, saber rattling, as soon as we start to see the consumers get nervous, the market does nothing. So we need to see consumer confidence stay up. Consumer confidence will lead to investor confidence, and hopefully it will lead to business confidence. We're starting to see some business confidence increase, not enough to spur capital spending, but we are starting to see some business confidence increase. If you move to the next slide, you'll see our economic forecast, and this is the last slide in my short presentation. If you were at a presentation of mine or one of my colleagues earlier this year, you would have seen our GDP forecast for 2020 about 2.5%. You'll see right now we're looking for down 6.5%. The IMF is looking for down 6.1. So U.S. GDP growth this year will be poor. We're looking for about 5% next year. So again, up, but not tremendous when you consider the depth that we've gone here. Global GDP will be down. The unemployment rate, take a look at that number, 9.3%. That's our estimate for the end of this year. The Fed is looking for 6.3% by the end of next year, 2021. We were at 3.5% in February of this year. So we believe we'll be recovering. We believe we'll be moving up. But the damage done by this shutdown has been extensive, and we're not going to get back to, that peak, that first slide that I showed you of Mount Mansfield. We don't think we're going to get back to that peak for some time forward. That should hold down inflation expectations, but it doesn't. It means that it's going to take us a little while to get back to where we were. So let me stop there and let me hand it back to you.
Thanks, John. We'll hear more from you in our Q&A discussion at the end of the program. Next, I'm going to do a Q&A with DECD Commissioner David Lehman. David, thanks for joining us. First, can you tell us where Connecticut is right now in the economic reopening process?
Sure. Thanks again for having me here, Greg. Great to be here with everyone. As I was telling John, I was kidding John before we started. I think the last time John and I did one of these sessions together was the first week in March, and we had to shut down the economy shortly thereafter. So we're in a different spot, but it's good to see John virtually and be here with you, Greg, and David Griggs as well. So in terms of the reopening process, right now we're in phase 2. We're firmly in phase 2. As many folks may be aware, we were going to start phase 3 here in the middle of July. We have put that on pause. My best guess is we will revisit that, in early August or late July. And really what drove that pause was not the numbers in Connecticut. The numbers in Connecticut in terms of transmission, testing positivity have been quite good. For those that don't necessarily follow it every day, we have around 75 new cases a day in Connecticut. We've been consistently around 1% testing positivity or less, really for the past several weeks at this point in time. We watch it pretty regularly given what's happening away from Connecticut, but we're very mindful of that. And I think that's what ultimately led us to put phase 3 on pause, is the uncertainty around community spread and the higher likelihood of community spread here in the state. And this is not just a Florida, Texas, Arizona issue. You're seeing this a lot closer to Connecticut, parts of Delaware, parts of Western Pennsylvania. So the virus definitely has been ticking up in certain areas, and we want to make sure that we don't let that happen here in Connecticut.
David, how concerned are you and the administration about another uptick in Connecticut?
Listen, we're concerned. I think our view is, let's make sure we plan for the worst and try to prevent it. But at the same time, let's hope it doesn't happen. Let's hope that what I call the culture of compliance here in Connecticut with the various mitigation measures continues. Connecticut, was one of the first states to have a mask mandate, and I think the more we learn about masks, and I realize there's schools of thought in this, but in my mind, masks are the cheapest kind of option we can have to make sure our economy continues, and that some semblance of normalcy continues. So people have done a very good job of that in Connecticut. We need to make sure we don't let up on that. Obviously, the physical distancing, the hand washing, trying to avoid crowds where you can, all of that matters as well. So I think our view to date has been let's make sure that we are not ignorant to what's happening away from us, but at the same time, let's try to prevent it, and let's try to preserve where Connecticut is right now, which is in a much better spot vis-a-vis English State.
Sure, and you mentioned that phase 3 now could happen late July, early August. What does phase 3 look like, and then what is phase 4 look like, and when is that scheduled?
Yeah, so I just want to be precise on this. So we'll revisit it around August 1st as
okay.
Well, Greg. There's not a set date. We basically hit pause, and again, I think we're mindful. Some of you probably saw many states. I think 20 or 25 states have now rolled back their reopening. California yesterday just did a very significant rollback of movie theaters, gyms, indoor dining, museums, zoos, even houses of worship in certain areas. Our goal is not to do that. We rather not roll back. We've had this very measured reopening, which I think has worked so well, so far so good. So we're not setting a date. We will revisit that, the phase 3 around August 1st. What was in phase 3 and the most significant parts of it, and I'm always, at the risk of generalizing, bars and nightclubs, certainly that was a big part of phase 3. In addition, indoor performing arts venues, the Bushnell Theater, for example, here in the Hartford area, was on that list, as well as other indoor venues around the state. Those are all part of phase 3. In addition, a big part of it was increasing the gathering sizes and the capacity at certain venues. So, for example, outdoor private gatherings was going to go from 100 to approximately 250 people. Right now, we've put that on pause, and we're still at 100. So those are a couple of the bigger parts of phase 3. You know, we technically did not have a phase 4. Phase 3 was the final phase. I think we kind of viewed back to normal after phase 3, whether that's, you know, we've typically had 4 weeks between phases, maybe a bit longer right now. So we'll keep watching it, but really after phase 3, almost all of the economy will be able to open. But what we've seen, and I'm sure some of the people viewing this feel this way, you know, the consumer confidence is so important. This isn't about the government saying you can or cannot open. You know, we want to make sure that the transmission remains low so people feel comfortable going out and socializing and going about economic activity, but doing so with a mask, because if you have high transmission, even with the economy open, that doesn't work, in my opinion. That's going to be bad for the economy.
Sure. What would you say is the state of the Connecticut economy right now? And what's the forecast for the rest of this year?
Yeah, so, you know, I saw John's numbers there, and I think the best data we have, many folks probably saw last week's data. It's with quite a delay, but the Q1 data came out from the BEA, and so just the high level, Connecticut, I think, was down 4.6% annualized in the first quarter. The country was actually down 5%. So, you know, we did better than other states in the Northeast, and obviously a little bit better than the country. But the reality is no one likes to see a decline in economic output, and that's what we saw. And the second quarter is unquestionably going to be worse, given April and early May, I think, was kind of peak virus in terms of the impact of it. So we'll see, you know, as many folks may be aware, Connecticut actually kept a lot of businesses open that other states didn't, like all of our manufacturing was always essential. Construction, even retail, we always allowed curbside pickup and delivery, even for what was, quote, non-essential retail. So I'm hopeful that on a relative basis, it comes through in the second quarter numbers. But the reality is we want to get people back to work as quickly as a state to do so. And really the employment rate, you know, whether we're at 11%, 15 or 15+%, very difficult to get an accurate read on that right now, given how much hiring and layoffs you've had, you know, many times in the same week. You know, we'll get a better picture of that, but I think that down mid-single digits annualized for the year is still probably a good number. And I don't have any reason to think that Connecticut's going to look vastly different than the country. You know, I'm hopeful we'll look a little bit better given, you know, how we're performing virus-wise and what we did in terms of keeping businesses open, but time's going to tell us.
And what do you think the fall looks like going into sort of the winter months? You know, is the Lehman administration and do you guys think things will be back to normal, or are you really fearing, you know, a second wave with the flu going to be an issue as well?
Yeah. So listen, we don't know. I'm obviously not an epidemiologist or infectious disease specialist, but I do spend a lot of time with our commissioner of DPH and others that are a little bit more in the know. And I think our view is, you know, and this is what I think is so challenging for business here versus other crises. We don't know when this is going to end, whether it's a vaccine that's mass produced. I think that still could be a year or even longer away. An effective therapeutic, perhaps that does come sooner, but when it's really out there in production, you know, that's still a ways off. Obviously, the whole world from a science perspective is focusing on this. I don't think you ever want to bet against science, but at the same time, I think we need to get comfortable living with this virus and wearing the mask and taking the precautions that we've started to do. I would say one thing from the administration's perspective, and we've been very vocal on this, we think it is critical that schools do go back and that we have levels of transmission and virus prevalence low enough where schools can safely go back. And for the reasons that I think folks are aware of, one, you know, from a mental health for kids and their own learning and their own advancement, we think that's critical. In-person learning is just so much better. And then secondly, as it relates to the economy for this group, childcare, you know, has been something that's been very tough to maintain. Our childcare went down to below 20% of capacity during COVID. Right now, we're closer to 40 or 50%, and it's coming back every day. But childcare was really hard to get, and I think when you can't have childcare and you don't have schools open, that's really bad for the economy. So we want to make sure that we maintain the virus low enough where we can safely do that and have kids go back to school come late August.
Sure. And I know, David, that this year, you know, you were looking at the state's economic development strategy. You were going to make some changes to incentives. I know there was an economic development strategy report that's supposed to come out. How has this crisis, or how will this crisis impact sort of Connecticut's economic development strategy, including what DECD does?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, so timing was not our strong suit on that. I think we were putting the finishing touches on that plan here in early March, or back in early March. But I think at a high level, the philosophy is not the same, right? We want to compete. We want Connecticut to compete on our merits, and I do think one of the call it silver linings of this crisis is, what was less valuable 4 or 5 months ago in terms of people or business is mine. And we can spend a lot of time on remote working and telecommuting, because I think that will be something that's around for a while. But I think Connecticut, what was a bit of a headwind is now a tailwind. But from a economic incentives perspective, our view is still the same. We want people to come to Connecticut because of who we are, not because we've got the check out. And any incentives that we do put forth, and listen, it's a competitive market, we need to do some of that. The framework of that being earn as you go, and earn as you maintain the jobs or maintain the investment, that's still going to remain the same. We're not going to change our philosophy because of the crisis.
Sure. And I know DECD did sort of an emergency loan program early in the crisis. Do you envision any sort of stimulus programs that the legislature might, adopt or pass in a special session or even early next year in response to the crisis?
Yeah, not in a special session right now. I think it's entirely possible as part of a broader recovery, and this gets down to kind of the tenor of the crisis and the disruption to the economy. Next year, perhaps. I would say that the federal response here relative to other crises with, in excess of $3 trillion of fiscal stimulus, plus, the Fed from an easing perspective, another $4 or $5 trillion, I believe. It was really unprecedented, and I think that's one of the things that has been very helpful. And one of the things, candidly, you're seeing in the stock market today, that I think has been, again, a significant benefit to the state of Connecticut and other states. So, Greg, I think as you're aware, but maybe just briefly for the group, close to $8 billion is coming to the state from these federal programs, $6.6 billion from the Paycheck Protection Program across 60,000 businesses, and then another 20,000 businesses got 1.4 billion, 1.3 billion rather, of emergency loans from the SBA. As the state did just under 50 million across a couple programs, but that just gives you a sense. The real firepower, and I think one of the real significant responses has been from the federal government to small business through those two programs, PPP and EIDL.
Sure. All right, David, thank you. We'll get back to you in the last session, the open Q&A, but we're going to move on now to David Griggs. David's going to talk about the 3 biggest opportunities and the 3 biggest challenges facing Greater Hartford for the rest of the year and the year ahead. David, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for having me part of Lehman and the work that DECD is doing. Thank you for adding us. We look at the future and the challenges and opportunities we can. We'll start with one of the this moment is momentum back. Know the area around the dollar. Moving forward, so we make sure that momentum that challenge that we're experiencing now that we are all living.
David, I'm sorry, you've been breaking up. I think you've got a bad connection.
Or learning remotely is the digital divide. Than now, we've got parts of businesses that don't have good access to stable internet, and this is certainly a problem and something that we have to address. Lastly, this is an opportunity for you to reach around the country to adopt those ideas here. This happens at not just every level, small business one of the key opportunities that I see is who we are as a company. And the next slide. It's important who we are and who we're not. And the part of this sector, if you look at this sector and the time that I anticipated to see a recovery,
Sorry about that. I think we were having problems with David's connection. So we're going to move on to our Q&A session right now with John and David Lehman. And maybe we'll have David Griggs call in on a different line. But let's move into the Q&A section now. And John and David, my first question to you guys is, David, you were talking a little bit about the federal government's response to the crisis so far. John, I want to start with you. What do you think about the federal government's response to the crisis so far, and has the federal government done enough to stimulate the economy?
Well, I will tell you, hats off to Ned Lamont on the state side. For a first-term governor, I think he's done a great job, and I would contrast what Ned Lamont has done to what's taken place on the federal side. We could probably have this call devolve into finger pointing, but the coordination down in Washington has been poor. I mean, it started off with the CDC and the test kits, and it really hasn't gotten better. And fortunately for Connecticut, the governors have been the ones that have really had to shoulder a lot of the direction on health screenings, the directions on how to open their economies, and I think by and large, I think Connecticut's been one of the leaders, but really we haven't gotten a lot of the support and the guidance that we should have gotten from the federal government, and whether it's Democrat, Republican, or whatever the fighting is going on down there, I'll let other people wade into that debate. But thank goodness, Connecticut has picked up the ball and run with it. So,
sure, David Lehman, do you think the federal government needs to do another round of stimulus package?
First, let me say that I think our top priority is going to get some more broadband up in Simsbury for Griggs. No, joking aside, I think the stimulus itself, again, away from the politics and coordination, because there's certainly a lot of lessons learned here. No, I think the stimulus to small business has been significant. I would like to see personally a change in PPP where certain businesses that either have not been able to open or their business model just doesn't work given some of the occupancy restrictions, some of the remaining $100 billion in PPP dollars be utilized for those businesses to, call it double dip or call it something different. But I think that would be something that's important. I think the question more broadly is at the state and local level, and perhaps healthcare as well, if there is going to be a fourth supplemental bill and more stimulus, I think it's probably better suited towards governments and localities, in addition to, again, being able to redirect some of that money for small business. But this all comes down to, if you tell me the crisis is going to last another 2 months versus, 6 or 12, I'll give you a different answer. And I think that's the uncertainty we need to get comfortable with.
Sure, and I've got some questions from the audience here that I'm going to start sharing. Which industries in Connecticut are likely to experience the most growth, and which industries are likely to see the greatest decline over the next 6 to 12 months? John or David?
Well, I'll take a stab, and then David will give you the real answer. I think from our standpoint, what we are very pleasantly surprised by, and I think a lot of our business customers, the people that I'm talking with, they are shocked at how well, if they're in a personal services business or a banker like me, I think we're shocked at how well our teams and our employees have been working remotely. So if there's a win for Connecticut, I think, boy, if you're looking to relocate out of New York or Boston, Connecticut's a great location because we have been functioning very well here. So I think you're going to continue seeing sort of the personal services, the professional type businesses doing very well. If you take a look at Connecticut, 71% of our manufacturing is advanced manufacturing, meaning requiring some pretty educated workers to produce the products using very sophisticated techniques. I think that kind of manufacturing will probably prosper as we go forward. So we could actually see our manufacturing base do better as we move forward because we've got the right kinds of businesses right now that will benefit from this. And then third, what we're seeing is, the types of businesses. If you're in biotech, we need smart people. You need lots of smart people throughout the entire spectrum. If Connecticut's got one thing, we've got lots of smart people. So if you're trying to build a biotech business, we've got not only the researchers that can develop the drugs, but we've got the people that can actually work in the plants to produce those drugs. So we've got the location, we've got the smart people, and we've got the hopefully the broadband. I know here in Fairfield County, we've got the broadband to support those businesses.
Just very quickly, unquestionably, the winner is teleworking or remote working, and Connecticut is well situated for that, given a big portion of Fairfield County in particular, was effectively commuting to New York or other areas down the New Haven line. So I do think we're well suited to capitalize from that. I'm not sure if it's 5% or 25% of kind of that workforce stays remote indefinitely, but I do think there's a real chance of that. And I think the flip side of that is the commercial real estate market, kind of conventional office space. I think you're going to see challenges there. And if you look through to what kind of the equity market is suggesting right now, I think you see that implied by some of the REIT equity prices and what those stocks are implying in terms of rents and occupancy. So we need to make sure that we capitalize on this remote working, and Connecticut is viewed as one of the places you want to be, whether it's to New York or other places. Given our schools and our healthcare, open spaces, et cetera. And I do think it's a once in a decade or two opportunity to make sure that we get it right and really capitalize.
David Griggs, we lost you a little bit during your presentation. So do you want to just take a few minutes to just go over your three opportunities and three challenges facing Greater Hartford?
Yeah, I think thank you for, I apologize for the challenge there. And thank you, David Lehman, for advocating for better internet service here in Simsbury. Appreciate that. Getting back to what we have, though, who we are as an economy, I simply wanted to point out that the industries that will be hardest hit, oil and gas, hospitality, tourism, these are things that we're not. And the things that we are, as mentioned, healthcare, one of the first industries expected to come back, as well as headquarters. And we certainly have a fair share of headquarters here in the Hartford region. So while on one hand, we're all being hit hard, on the other, we can take some solace in the fact that the industries that have made us great should be the ones that come back the soonest and are the ones that will carry us forward. The other piece, and David and John just mentioned as well, one of our greatest opportunities is our location, tucked in between two very large markets that have been hit really hard by the COVID situation. We're seeing it already in articles out of the Wall Street Journal about Connecticut and the opportunities of suburban living in Connecticut. This is an opportunity for us, as we only need to really attract a small portion of the people who are looking to get out in order for them to make a significant impact here in the Hartford region. So getting out and being more aggressive and just telling who we are, telling the world who we are, is certainly a huge opportunity for us. Thank you.
Sure. And David, a follow-up question, and I know you've been working on, moving the Metro Hartford Alliance into more of an economic development organization. Has COVID-19 changed Metro Hartford Alliance's strategy at all in terms of recruitment?
In terms of recruitment, no. To a point David Lehman made earlier, the strategies and philosophies of economic development haven't changed, especially as they relate to attraction. We are who we are. We have the skills that are inherent in our region that companies want. Our challenge is to identify those companies today so that we can continue to attract more. It's not, we don't have to shift. The thing that we do have to do, however, is certainly pay more attention to the companies we have and make sure that the companies that we have stay strong through this pandemic.
Sure. David Lehman, next question. I want to start with you. Downtown Hartford and Hartford in general has experienced some momentum in recent years. What kind of impact do you think COVID-19 is going to have short-term and longer-term on the momentum of the city of Hartford?
Well, listen, I think short-term, and this is naive to Hartford, but all cities, I think office space, again, what I call conventional office space, I think that is going to be challenged. You just look right now, many folks are remote commuting. I think slowly you're going to see people come back, whether that's over the next month or 6 months, we don't know. But when you think about the ancillary businesses, parking, restaurants, not just the sandwich shop, but Max's. The reality is that, plus the fact that business travel is just not happening right now, kind of the economy of our CBDs, at least as it relates to that, the business, again, put residential aside, I think that's just challenged. And I think it's tough to fight that because, that's the virus that's dictating that. Post the virus, though, outside of this shift where I think you could see more remote work, I do think the momentum and the attractiveness of Hartford and what I think was driving many businesses to it, I still think that's there. And I think that's going to continue. I do think it probably slows it down a bit. But again, that's not a Hartford issue. That's a COVID issue and kind of a systemic shift that I think may be happening in how business gets done in the country.
Sure. David Griggs, same question. How do you think COVID is going to impact Hartford, downtown Hartford, and what's the outlook, I guess, in the next 6 months to a year?
Sure. It's certainly going to have an impact. And one of the things that we're doing as the Alliance is we're trying to understand from our largest employers what their plans are for coming back to work and refilling the offices. That's going to help us inform our small businesses, the service industry, of what they can expect. So we mentioned Max's. When can Max's expect to be able to see some of their patrons coming back into downtown Hartford so that we can get them back up and running? There's certainly an impact, and that runs across the entire service sector. We've already seen it. The one bright spot that we have is that Hartford began a trend a few years ago to have more residential in our downtown core. Those residents do demand services the same way anybody does in whatever community you live in. You want to have access to food and entertainment and any of the other things that come with it. So having those residents in our downtown core is certainly helping. Now, if we had more residents in our downtown core, we would see hopefully some of our service sector come back even quicker. But that's one of our biggest challenges, is getting that momentum back, getting the faith in the Hartford market again.
Sure. John, you talked a lot about consumer confidence, and then you talked about the impact of the extra $600 federal unemployment benefits. What's your thoughts on, should the federal government, extend that benefit, or how should that benefit be treated?
Well, I certainly hope they extend it some way, but I actually liked Governor Lamont's suggestion, and I think he agreed with the Governor, Rob Portman, where they said, you know what, we need to have some transition plan here where people could go back to work, not lose the entire benefit entirely, but maybe move off of that and get some kind of a stipend. If they could come up with something that would give people the ability to go back to work, because, you know, they're going to be going back to work, but they're probably going to be going back at reduced hours. So do something that could help them transition back to work. That would be great. But just, you know, as it stands now, July 31, there's a cliff, and that would be a big negative. So, you know, finding some way to transition. And, you know, I'm hoping that Governor Lamont is actually one of the leaders on trying to come up with a plan along those lines.
Sure. David Lehman, does Connecticut's labor force have the skills necessary to move the Connecticut economy forward? Where are the gaps and what needs to be done to fill them?
Yeah, so that's a question with a very long answer, but I'll try to be concise. So I think, in short, yes is the answer. But, you know, the economy is constantly evolving, right? Connecticut, no matter, depending on how you rank it, we have one of the most well-educated and diverse labor forces in the country, certainly on a per capita basis. And I think the question is, though, you know, given how our economy has evolved and likely will continue to evolve post-COVID, kind of accelerate from that, making sure that, you know, the credentials and skills that our residents need are there, because that is probably, in all the conversations that I've had and David Griggs and his team have had, you know, ability to access workforce at a fair rate, if you will, is probably number one or number two on everyone's list that's considering Connecticut. So, you know, making sure that we market our workforce that we have appropriately, I think, is key to getting more business to invest in the state, and ultimately that ecosystem, you know, gets to critical mass here. So the Governor's Workforce Council, which was announced last October, you know, that continues to be a major initiative. Obviously, COVID has taken center stage, rightly so, but you should expect to hear more announcements and ultimately the work product from that later this summer or early fall. But I think we're very focused on maintaining our advantage in workforce, knowing that we're going to need to keep adapting faster than we have in the past.
Sure. David Griggs, question for you. You know, we know that the big corporations play a big role in particularly in downtown Hartford in terms of the economic impact. What role do you think the large corporates have downtown in terms of helping stem the recovery in the months ahead?
Well, we certainly look to our big corporate citizens a lot for assistance, but one of the biggest things that they provide us is jobs. And right now, I think that's one of the biggest opportunities we've got, is to have all of those, as many of those employees back in the offices, which seems contrary to a lot of what we're doing. We're all working from home. We're all being very productive. Unintended consequences of that, and you know, we're starting to see some studies come out around culture and the culture of a company, which typically resides within the four walls of the company, not within the four walls of your home. The innovation that happens within a company happens because we're bringing people together and they're sharing the ideas that they've got, and so the innovation and the culture of our companies is at stake in some regards as this continues on. Not to mention, you know, the cybersecurity and all kinds of other issues, unintended, but are there as well. But for the city of Hartford and our corporate community, having that workforce back in Hartford and helping to get Hartford the momentum back is key.
Sure. David Lehman, a direct question for you. What are the directions for hotels regarding guests arriving from the 19 states with quarantine orders? What types of precautions should those hotels be making?
Yeah, so we've spoken to the hotels. What we're asking them to do is just make guests aware that there is a quarantine restriction. We've also provided signage for those that maybe are watching and haven't seen it. It's up on our website that basically advises them of the quarantine mandate. So really, we're using hotels to help get the message out, and that's really what we're asking of them.
Sure. And then this might be another question that, David, you may want to start the conversation on. What will COVID's economic impact mean for the state budget, and how should lawmakers respond? I know that's not your direct purview, but
No, of course. Well, listen, we've seen in terms of the fiscal year that just ended, the cost was, between 500 and 600 million, I think, when all was said and done versus what we expected. I think the question is for the fiscal year we just started and in the subsequent year, what is it? And again, this gets back to the duration question, but the estimates have been between 1 and upwards of $2+ billion. So that's, 5 to 10+% of our annual budget. And I think in the out years, it was 10 or 10+%. So we those are point in time estimates. We don't know. I mentioned before, there's some question about if there is going to be federal support for states and localities. So that's the TBD. And then if we recover quicker, obviously that number will come back, or if we draw more taxpayers into the state as a result of some of the migration that'll come back. So it's a moving target, but anywhere from 1 to over 2 billion has been what's been estimated by OPM State, and that'll keep getting up every 3 months as we track this.
Sure. John, what do you think of what's going to happen with mortgage delinquencies and loan delinquencies in the months ahead as a result of COVID? Any thoughts there?
Well, I mean, that's a huge area for bankers and the industry as a whole. That's one of the reasons why we're hoping that consumers get that support. But you saw this morning with some of the bank earnings, J.P. Morgan, and the banks are taking big reserves, which is prudent. So we don't believe we're going to see sort of the 2008 2009 type declines in banking, but banks are we're being very prudent, and it makes sense to add to reserves. We definitely don't think we're going to see an 08 09 type scenario though. Nothing along those lines with regard to bad debts and write-offs, but you're seeing that right now. You're going to see that as the banks report. You're going to see them adding to loan loss reserves, which is thoughtful. So,
sure. What about lending standards in small businesses, John? Do you think are banks going to tighten up their standards a little bit, and will that maybe create challenges in terms of access to credit?
I know. Again, speaking about financial stocks in general, I know that the banks right now are actually in pretty good shape, and if there are good credits out there, they'd love to lend. That we're hearing that from when we're on all the conference calls from Bank of America, J.P. Morgan. They would like to lend. Part of their problem though is the low interest rate environment that we're looking at. It's more the net interest margin. The Fed is keeping rates low, so the attractiveness of the lending business isn't there. But boy, I'll tell you, I know when we're on the conference calls with all these companies, they want to lend. They want to lend.
Sure. And last question I wanted to get to David Griggs. David, what do you think, is there anything you think the Connecticut legislator should do to help jumpstart the economy as we move into the months ahead, and also maybe next legislative session into January?
Well, thanks for teeing
There's
me
a
up
simple
for
one
that.
for you, David. Please. I've got my pencil ready. Please go ahead.
Thank you. We're recording this too, right?
Yeah, it's only going to be blasted to all of our subscribers, David. Don't worry.
Good. Look, I think I'm going to go back to what I said earlier, and that's best practice. We don't have to come up with the solution all on our own. We need to take a look at what other states are doing, what they're implementing, and how they're doing it. Granted, there are situations that are unique to Connecticut, but the whole COVID thing is not, it's a worldwide pandemic. So we should be looking to other communities, see what they're doing, and implement those practices here. What they are, ill-prepared to answer the question, but I know the answers are out there.
Sure. All right, we're running out of time today, so I'd like to wrap up the session by thanking all of our speakers for joining us, as well as our sponsors, including the UConn School of Business and Cox Business, for supporting this webinar. If you want to follow up with anything you heard today, a recording of the webinar will be available on HBJ's website or New Haven Business website under the Events tab. Thank you for joining us today, and have a good rest of the day. And David, and John, I appreciate you guys joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.